I never imagined that losing everything would teach me what I actually owned. The funeral director handed me a brass key that felt heavier than grief itself, and I knew my life had just split into before and after like wood under an axe. Thank you so much for watching Granny's narrative. Please subscribe and tell us where you are watching from in the comment. 3 months of caring for Dad through his final decline had left me hollow as driftwood. Sarah breezed in for the last 2 weeks with her expensive perfume and efficient clipboard, managing his medication schedule like a corporate merger while I held his hand through the long nights when morphine could not touch whatever pain lived deeper than bone. The lawyer's office smelled like old coffee and ambition. Sarah sat across from me in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, her manicured fingers drumming against leather like she was calculating compound interest. When the will was read, her smile cut the air clean. To my daughter Sarah, I leave the family home at 1247 Maple Street and all contents therein. The words rolled off the attorney's tongue like honey off a warm spoon. To my daughter Rachel, I leave the cabin property on Mountain View Road. Sarah exhaled like someone who had been holding her breath for years. Well, she said afterward in the elevator, I suppose that settles who Dad trusted to handle real responsibility. Her voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone whose calculations had finally balanced. I could have mentioned the 3 a.m. medication schedules, the physical therapy appointments I never missed, the way I learned to read his pain in the set of his shoulders. Instead I said nothing because arguing with Sarah was like trying to nail water to a wall, exhausting and pointless. The drive to the cabin took 43 minutes through mountain roads that twisted like a confused river. My truck coughed and wheezed on every incline, the check engine light glowing like an accusation. I had not been to the cabin since childhood summers when Dad would take us fishing and Sarah would complain about the mosquitoes and the lack of cell service. The building sagged between tall pines like an old man who had given up on standing straight. Shingles curled and weathered, porch steps worn smooth by decades of boots. A real estate sign tilted drunkenly near the mailbox. Sarah Hendricks Realty printed in gold letters that caught the afternoon light like a small threat. I fished the key from the envelope and turned it in a lock that had been recently oiled. The door swung open with a sigh that sounded almost relieved. The scent that greeted me was not the musty breath of abandonment I expected. Instead, lemon oil and coffee, warm bread and wood smoke. The floors gleamed with recent care. A handmade quilt lay folded over the back of an old sofa, hospital corners precise as military standards. My pulse quickened in the quiet way fear begins, like water starting to boil. I called hello into the rooms and heard footsteps in the kitchen, unhurried and deliberate. A woman appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dish towel in her hands. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back and eyes the color of deep water. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and feeling no need to apologize for it. You must be Rachel, she said, drying her hands with methodical care. I am Elena Martinez. Your father asked me to stay until you arrived. The kitchen table held a manila folder thick with documents. Elena sat across from me and explained with gentle precision that Dad had set up a living trust 3 years earlier. The cabin belonged to the Pine Ridge Trust, and she was the beneficiary. I inherited the land. She inherited the building. My mouth went dry as old paper. You are telling me I own dirt but not the house sitting on it. Essentially yes, she said without flinching. Your father faced foreclosure when the medical bills accumulated faster than his insurance could process them. The trust arrangement protected the cabin while allowing someone he trusted to maintain it. She opened the folder and removed 2 envelopes, both addressed in Dad's careful handwriting. One for me, one for Sarah. He asked me to deliver these after the will was read. I broke the seal with fingers that wanted to shake. Dad's voice rose from the page in neat blue ink. My dearest Rachel, if you are reading this, then I failed to tell you what I should have while I could. He explained the financial crisis I had never known about, the impossible choice between losing everything and finding another way. He wrote about Elena, who had answered his advertisement for a caretaker and stayed to become something more precious than he had words for. 7 years of quiet companionship. She had loved this place and him with equal dedication. He wrote about the shame of needing help and the greater shame of hiding it. About watching me sacrifice my own life to care for him, while Sarah managed his affairs with competent distance. He had tried to protect us both in different ways, and succeeded in protecting neither. But there was more. There was always more with Dad. Buried in the middle of the letter like a seed waiting for the right season was a paragraph that made my hands go still. In 1982, while repairing the back porch foundation, I discovered what I believed to be prehistoric cave paintings in the limestone outcropping behind the cabin. I photographed everything, documented coordinates, researched carefully. I kept this quiet to protect the site from treasure hunters and to protect my daughters from what greed does to families. Elena knows the location. The decision of what to do belongs to you now. I looked up at Elena, who was watching me with patient attention. He found something. She nodded. In the cave system behind the property. Extensive pictographs, some petroglyphs, artifacts he was careful never to disturb. He contacted the State Archaeological Commission 6 months before he died. They have been waiting for your call. My heart did something complicated in my chest, part flutter, part stone. I folded the letter and slid it into my jacket pocket where it seemed to pulse like a second heartbeat. Show me, I said. Elena led me up a narrow trail that wound between granite boulders and scrub oak. The path was well maintained, switchbacks graded to accommodate age and weather. We climbed for 20 minutes until the trees opened onto a small clearing where limestone cliffs rose like ancient walls. The cave entrance was barely wider than a doorway, hidden behind a curtain of vine maple that Elena pushed aside with reverent care. She handed me a flashlight and gestured me forward. Inside, the beam illuminated a gallery that stole my breath. Red ochre figures danced across stone walls, human forms with raised arms, animals in profile, spirals and dots and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in the wavering light. Some images were painted, others carved deep into the rock face with tools that had turned to dust centuries before my grandfather was born. I stood in that space and felt time collapse like a telescope closing. These walls had been galleries when Rome was still a collection of mud huts, when the pyramids were blueprints, when the first Europeans were still trying to figure out which end of a horse to climb onto. God, I whispered, and the word echoed back to me from stone that had heard prayers in languages I could not begin to imagine. Elena touched my shoulder gently. Your father spent years researching, cross-referencing with museum collections and university archives. He believed these were created by ancestors of the local tribal communities. He wanted you to understand what you were protecting. We stood in the cave until the light faded and then walked back in gathering dusk, both of us quiet with the weight of what we had seen. At the cabin, Elena heated soup while I sat at the kitchen table and tried to recalibrate my understanding of what I had inherited. This was not just a property dispute between sisters. This was a responsibility that stretched back further than family memory, deeper than deed records, more valuable than any number Sarah might calculate on her accounting ledgers. I called the State Archaeological Commission that evening and left a message for Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the name Dad had written in the margin of his letter. I spelled my name carefully and said the words that would reshape my next decade. I am the landowner at the Mountain View Road site. I have documentation and am ready to coordinate. Elena made up the spare bedroom with sheets that smelled like lavender and mountain air. I lay awake listening to the night sounds, owl calls and coyote song and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Somewhere in that darkness was a cave full of voices from a world I was only beginning to understand. Dr. Hayes called the next morning while I was drinking coffee on the porch and watching the sun paint the cliffs gold. Her voice carried the precise enthusiasm of someone who had spent her career studying the past and still found wonder in it. We have been hoping to hear from you, she said. Your father's preliminary documentation is exceptional. When can we meet? That afternoon, her truck climbed the mountain road followed by 2 graduate students in a vehicle loaded with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Dr. Hayes stepped out wearing khaki pants and hiking boots, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the kind of calm competence that immediately made me trust her judgment. We spent 3 hours in the cave with cameras and measuring tools, documenting what Dad had already cataloged, while the students took notes that would become part of an official record. Dr. Hayes moved with the care of someone handling sacred objects, which I supposed was exactly what she was doing. "This site is extraordinary," she said when we emerged into afternoon light. "The pictographs span multiple time periods, possibly 1,000 years of continuous use. The preservation is remarkable. Your father was wise to keep this protected." "What happens now?" "Yes. Now we file for emergency protection status while we conduct a full survey. The site will be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. There will be federal protections, possibly some funding for preservation and research. Most importantly, the local tribal council will be consulted on all decisions. This belongs to them in ways that have nothing to do with property law." I nodded, feeling the weight of stewardship settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat I would learn to wear with grace. That evening Sarah called. Her voice had the sharp edge it always carried when she was about to deliver news she expected me to dislike. "I drove by the cabin today," she said without preamble. "There were government vehicles parked there." "What are you doing, Rachel?" "Following Dad's wishes," I said. "He left instructions about the cave paintings behind the property. I am coordinating with state archaeologists to ensure proper protection." "Cave paintings." Her laugh had no humor in it. "Course. Dad was always chasing some fantasy that would make him feel important." "How much is this going to cost?" "It is not going to cost anything, Sarah. In fact, there may be grant money available for site preservation and research." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that meant she was recalculating her position. "Rachel," she said finally, her voice sliding toward the tone she used with difficult clients, "you need to think practically. That property could be developed. Mountain views, proximity to the ski area. There is serious money to be made if you do not tie it up with government red tape." "The money is not the point," I said. "Money is always the point," she replied. "Some of us just pretend otherwise." After she hung up, I walked up to the cave entrance and stood in the gathering dark. I could not see the paintings, but I could feel them there in the limestone, patient and permanent in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market fluctuations. Elena found me there an hour later, carrying a cup of tea that steamed in the cool air. "You all right?" she asked. "I'm starting to understand why Dad kept this secret," I said. "Sarah would have had this place surveyed and subdivided before the ink dried on the death certificate. Some people see dollar signs where others see heritage," Elena said. "Your father spent years trying to figure out how to protect both his daughters from their own worst instincts. I think he succeeded. The next few weeks developed a rhythm that felt like growing into a new skin. Dr. Hayes and her team arrived each morning to continue their survey work, documenting every figure on the cave walls with precision that bordered on worship. I spent my days learning the vocabulary of archaeology, the difference between pictographs and petroglyphs, the significance of mineral pigments and tool marks. Elena and I fell into an easy partnership, sharing cooking duties and evening conversations about everything except the elephant in the room, which was that we were both learning to care for each other in the careful way of people who have been alone too long to trust easily. The State Archaeological Commission filed their preliminary report on a Tuesday that started ordinary and ended revolutionary. Dr. Hayes called to tell me the site had been approved for emergency protection status and would be fast-tracked for inclusion on the National Register. "This changes everything," she said. "Federal law now protects the site from unauthorized disturbance. Any development within a quarter mile requires archaeological review. You have essentially created a preservation zone around the entire property." I hung up and walked outside to look at the land with new eyes. The scrub oak and granite outcroppings, the distant view of snow-capped peaks, the way afternoon light fell across the clearing where Elena had strung a clothesline between two pines. All of it was now part of something larger than property ownership, something that connected me to voices that had been speaking from stone walls since before my language existed. Sarah arrived that afternoon in her white SUV, stepping out onto the gravel in heels that had never been intended for mountain terrain. She wore her lawyer face, all sharp angles and strategic patience. "We need to talk," she said, following me into the cabin where Elena was rolling out pie dough with methodical precision. About what? I asked, though I knew the answer. About this preservation nonsense that is destroying our property values, she said, her voice rising slightly. Do you have any idea what you have done? No serious developer will touch this area now. You have created a bureaucratic nightmare. I have protected a cultural treasure, I said. Dad wanted me to protect it. Dad wanted a lot of things, Sarah snapped. He also wanted to pay his medical bills without bankrupting his family. Sometimes practical concerns have to outweigh sentimental ones. Elena looked up from her pastry board, her expression calm but watchful. Would you like some coffee, Sarah? She asked in the tone she might use to offer a drink to someone who was clearly having a difficult day. Sarah ignored her and pulled out her phone, scrolling through what looked like real estate listings. I have had 3 separate developers express interest in this property. Combined purchase of your land and the cabin could net us close to $2 million if we move quickly. Yes. We are family, Rachel. This affects both of us. The cabin belongs to Elena, I said. The trust is very clear about that. Trusts can be challenged, Sarah said with the confidence of someone who had made a career out of challenging inconvenient documents, especially when they were created by someone who was demonstrably not thinking clearly. Elena set down her rolling pin with deliberate care. Mr. Hendricks was thinking very clearly when he set up the trust, she said. He was protecting something he valued more than money. Sarah turned to face her directly for the first time since arriving. And who are you exactly? The woman who convinced a sick old man to sign over his property. Elena did not flinch. I am the woman who loved your father and this place enough to care for both when no one else would. I am the woman who held his hand when he died while you were in Denver closing a deal. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the next room. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, and seemed to deflate slightly. He never told me, she said finally, and for just a moment her voice sounded like the little girl who used to cry when Dad went away on business trips. He did not know how, Elena replied gently. He thought you would see caring as weakness. Sarah stared at her for a long moment, then gathered herself back into the armor of professional competence. This is very touching, she said, but it does not change the legal reality. That archaeological designation creates liability issues. What happens when tourists start showing up? What about insurance? Environmental impact studies? I pulled out the folder of documents Dr. Hayes had left me and spread them across the kitchen table. Site management plan, federal protection guidelines, tribal consultation protocols, everything mapped out with a kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that would have impressed even Sarah. It has all been considered, I said. The site will be managed jointly by the State Commission and the Tribal Cultural Preservation Office. Limited access, educational programs, research partnerships with universities. Elena and I will serve as on-site liaisons. Sarah scanned the documents with the quick efficiency of someone who read contracts for a living. Her expression shifted from skepticism to grudging respect to something that might have been worry. Rachel, she said, sitting down heavily in one of Elena's kitchen chairs, do you understand what you are committing to? This is not just about preserving some cave paintings. You are talking about dedicating your life to this place. What about your career? Your retirement? What happens if you get sick? The questions hung in the air like smoke from a fire you could not put out. I had been so focused on protecting the site that I had not fully considered what protection would require of me. Elena poured coffee into 3 cups and set them on the table with quiet authority. Sometimes, she said, the thing that needs protecting teaches you who you need to become in order to protect it. Over the following months, Sarah and I developed a careful détente built around shared practical concerns and mutual recognition that neither of us was going to change the other's fundamental nature. She helped me navigate the legal complexities of site management while I helped her understand why some things were worth more than their market value. The cave paintings taught me patience in ways I had never learned from any human teacher. I spent hours sitting in that limestone gallery, watching how light changed the appearance of the figures throughout the day, how shadows brought certain images forward while others receded into stone silence. Dr. Hayes and her team conducted their formal survey with scientific rigor that bordered on reverence. Each pictograph was photographed, measured, analyzed for pigment composition and tool marks. The radiocarbon dating of charcoal deposits revealed human presence spanning over 800 years, multiple generations who had returned to this sacred space to leave their marks on stone that would outlast empires. The Tribal Cultural Preservation Office assigned a liaison, an elderly woman named Mary Clearwater, who moved through the cave like she was visiting the home of beloved relatives. She spent a full day with me and Elena, explaining the significance of certain symbols, the seasonal ceremonies that might have taken place in the outer chambers, the way these walls connected her people to ancestors who had sung songs in languages that existed now only in stone. "This is not your heritage," she said to me without accusation, "but you have become its keeper. That is sacred work. It changes you whether you expect it or not." I established the Mountain View Heritage Foundation with a bank account that started at $47 and the kind of simple mission statement that could fit on a business card: to protect, preserve, and share the cultural treasures of Mountain View Road in partnership with indigenous communities and scientific institutions. Sarah designed the letterhead, Elena managed the books, and I wrote grant applications with the determination of someone who had discovered that bureaucracy could be a tool of protection rather than obstruction. Small gifts started arriving from sources I had not expected. The local historical society, a retired teacher who had read about the site in the newspaper, university students who sent $20 bills with notes about hoping to visit someday. Elena and I settled into a domestic rhythm that neither of us named but both of us cherished. We shared morning coffee and evening meals, divided household tasks with the efficiency of people who had learned to make decisions together. We slept in separate bedrooms but woke to the shared purpose of tending something larger than either of us could protect alone. On quiet evenings, I would read aloud from Dad's journals while Elena mended clothes or worked on her endless supply of quilting projects. His words took on new meaning in the lamplight of the cabin he had tried so hard to preserve. "I think he would be proud," she said one night after I finished a particularly difficult entry about his fears for our family's future. "He wanted you to find your way to this work. He just did not know how to show you the path." Sarah visited more frequently as the site gained recognition, initially to monitor potential legal complications but increasingly out of what looked suspiciously like genuine interest. She brought her real estate expertise to bear on practical questions about visitor access and parking, helped design signage that provided information without encouraging vandalism, even contributed to the foundation fund when she thought I was not paying attention. The first official visitors arrived on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the promise of snow. A busload of university anthropology students, led by a professor who had been corresponding with Dr. Hayes about incorporating the site into his curriculum. I watched 20-year-olds file into the cave with the reverence usually reserved for cathedrals, listened to their whispered conversations about mineral pigments and cultural continuity, saw some of them emerge with tears in their eyes because they had touched something vast and ancient and irreplaceable. This is what preservation looks like, I thought. Not locked doors and keep-out signs, but shared wonder and careful education and the kind of respect that grows from understanding. The National Register designation came through in early spring, accompanied by a small ceremony that brought together state officials, tribal representatives, university researchers, and what seemed like half the population of the nearest town. Sarah wore a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and gave a brief speech about the importance of protecting cultural heritage that would have made Dad laugh with pride. Elena and I stood together at the edge of the crowd, watching people take photographs and exchange business cards and make plans for future collaboration. The cave paintings were no longer our secret, but they remained our responsibility in ways that felt both lighter and heavier than when we had carried the burden alone. That evening, after the last visitor had driven back down the mountain road, the three of us sat on the cabin porch with glasses of wine and the satisfied exhaustion of people who have thrown a successful party. "So what now?" Sarah asked, swirling her wine in the kind of gesture she had probably learned at client dinners, but which looked natural in the mountain twilight. "Now we do the work," Elena said simply. "Every day. For as long as the work needs doing." I leaned back in my chair and listened to the night sounds beginning, the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a great horned owl hunting in the darkness. Somewhere behind us, limestone walls held paintings that connected this moment to countless other moments stretching back through time like links in an unbroken chain. The responsibility no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like coming home to work I had been meant to do all along, in a place I had been meant to protect, with people who had become my chosen family through the simple act of caring about the same precious things. I thought about Dad's letter, still folded in my jacket pocket like a talisman. He had been wrong about one thing. He had not failed to tell me what I needed to know. He had shown me through every careful choice he made, every sacrifice he offered, every moment he chose protection over profit. The cave paintings would outlast all of us, as they had outlasted centuries of human ambition and folly. But while we were here, we would stand guard with flashlights and filing cabinets, with grant applications and visitor guidelines, with morning coffee and evening conversations about the sacred ordinary work of keeping precious things safe. Sarah finished her wine and stood to leave, pausing to hug Elena and then, after a moment of visible internal debate, me. "Drive carefully," I said, and meant it. After her taillights disappeared down the mountain, Elena and I sat in companionable silence until the stars came out bright and close in the thin mountain air. Tomorrow there would be emails to answer and reports to file and a dozen small tasks that added up to the patient work of stewardship. Tonight there was just this: the weight of evening air and the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness behind us, ancient voices continued their stone conversations with anyone willing to listen carefully enough to hear them. I reached over and took Elena's hand, feeling the calluses from years of practical work and the warmth of someone who had chosen to stay when staying meant accepting responsibility for things larger than personal comfort. "Thank you," I said, "for helping me understand what Dad was trying to give me." "Thank you," she replied, "for being willing to receive it." We sat holding hands until the night air grew cold enough to drive us inside, where the wood stove waited to warm our bones and the kitchen promised tea and the familiar comfort of shared domestic rhythms. Outside, the mountain settled into darkness, patient and permanent and protected by the kind of love that shows up every day ready to do whatever the work requires. The cave paintings slept in their limestone gallery, safe for another night under the guardianship of people who had learned that some inheritances could not be measured in dollars, but only in the daily choice to honor what had been entrusted to their care. In the morning, there would be new challenges and old responsibilities and the endless small acts of stewardship that add up to a life worth living. Tonight there was just this: the satisfaction of knowing that precious things remained precious, that sacred places remained sacred, that some stories continued exactly as they should when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary work with quiet dedication and shared love. The mountain breathed around us, ancient and alive, holding its secret safe for another generation of guardians who would learn, as we had learned, that the greatest inheritance is not what we receive but what we choose to protect for those who come after us. Years passed like seasons, each bringing new challenges and deeper understanding. The foundation grew from my $47 beginning into something substantial, supported by federal grants and private donations from people who understood that some treasures belong to everyone and no one at the same time. Sarah eventually sold the family home and moved to a smaller place closer to the mountains, claiming she wanted to be nearer to her investment but really, I suspected, wanting to be part of something larger than quarterly profit reports. She served on the foundation board with the same fierce attention to detail she brought to real estate deals, except now she was protecting something instead of selling it. Elena and I married in a simple ceremony in the clearing above the cave, with Mary Clearwater offering a blessing in her native language and Dr. Hayes serving as witness. Sarah cried during the vows and denied it afterward, but the photographs captured her joy in ways that made me understand how much of her hardness had always been protection against a world that rarely rewarded tenderness. The site became a model for community-based cultural preservation, visited by delegations from other states struggling with similar questions about how to protect sacred places without destroying them with attention. I gave presentations at conferences where I felt like an imposter until Elena reminded me that expertise comes from doing the work day after day, year after year, until you know in your bones what needs protecting and how to protect it. We established the Mountain View Cultural Education Center in a building designed to blend with the landscape. Solar panels hidden among the trees and natural materials that would weather into beauty rather than decay into ugliness. School groups came to learn about indigenous history and archaeological methods, touching reproduction artifacts while the originals remained safe in climate-controlled storage. The cave itself we kept strictly limited, 10 visitors per day maximum, and only with trained guides who understood that wonder was more important than photography. Some people complained about the restrictions until they experienced the profound silence of standing before those painted walls and realized they were in the presence of something that demanded reverence rather than consumption. I learned to read the mountain seasons like a familiar book, knowing when spring snowmelt would make the trails treacherous, when summer thunderstorms would drive visitors back to the safety of the education center, when autumn colors would bring photographers seeking the perfect shot of ancient art framed by golden aspen leaves. Each season brought different responsibilities and different rewards. Elena became the Foundation's unofficial philosopher, the one who could explain to frustrated visitors why some things were worth protecting precisely because they could not be possessed, why limits on access actually increased rather than diminished the site's value. She had a way of speaking about stewardship that made people want to become better versions of themselves, the kind of people who left places better than they found them. The pictographs themselves seemed to change depending on the light and the season and my own state of mind. Images I had seen hundreds of times would suddenly reveal new details, new connections, new stories I had not noticed before. Dr. Hayes explained that this was normal, that our brains were constantly making new patterns from familiar information, but it felt more magical than scientific, like the ancient artists were still teaching lessons to anyone patient enough to keep looking. Sarah surprised me by developing what could only be called a spiritual relationship with the site, spending hours in the outer chambers where visitors were not allowed, sitting in meditation or prayer or whatever she called her private communion with the painted walls. She never spoke about these experiences, but they softened something in her face that had been sharp for as long as I could remember. One winter morning when the snow lay deep and white across the mountainside, I found her in the cave with tears on her cheeks, staring at a spiral pattern that seemed to glow in her flashlight beam. "It makes you feel so small," she said without embarrassment. "But also so connected. Like all the people who ever worried about money or status or being important were missing the point completely." I sat beside her on the cold stone floor and followed her gaze to the spiral that wound inward and outward simultaneously, a symbol that could represent anything from the cycle of seasons to the structure of galaxies to the pattern of growth in a nautilus shell. "Dad would have loved this," I said. All those years he spent reading about history and archaeology, dreaming about discoveries. He had the real thing in his backyard and probably walked past the cave entrance 1,000 times without knowing. "Maybe he did know," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe that is why he protected it the only way he knew how, by keeping it secret until we were ready to receive it properly." We sat in the painted silence until our breath began to fog in the cold air, then walked back to the cabin where Elena had coffee waiting and wood crackling in the stove. These moments of shared understanding with Sarah had become more frequent over the years, small bridges built across the gap that had separated us since childhood. The Foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary with a gathering that brought together everyone who had been part of the site's preservation and development. Tribal elders shared traditional stories that connected to images on the cave walls. University researchers presented findings that placed the site in the broader context of indigenous cultural history. Government officials spoke about the importance of protecting cultural heritage for future generations. But the moment that mattered most to me came at the end of the formal program, when Mary Clearwater stood and asked for quiet attention. She spoke about the responsibility that comes with being entrusted with sacred places, about the generations of ancestors who had painted those walls and the generations of descendants who would inherit whatever we left behind. "This place chose its guardians well," she said, looking directly at Elena and me and Sarah. "You have shown that protection and sharing can exist together, that reverence and education can walk the same path. The ancestors are pleased." Later, as guests dispersed back to their various lives and commitments, I walked up to the cave entrance and stood in the familiar silence. The painted figures seemed to dance in the beam of my flashlight, human forms with raised arms that could be celebrating or worshipping or simply reaching toward something beyond the reach of stone and pigment. I thought about Dad and the letter he had left me, about the long journey from inheriting problems to inheriting purpose, about the way life could surprise you with gifts disguised as burdens and blessings hidden inside difficulties. He had given me more than property or responsibility. He had given me the chance to become someone worth becoming, someone whose life mattered because of what she chose to protect rather than what she managed to accumulate. Elena found me there as she always did when I needed thinking time alone with the ancient voices. She slipped her arm through mine and we stood together watching shadows shift across painted walls, two middle-aged women who had somehow stumbled into work that felt like calling. Regrets? She asked, the question she posed periodically to make sure I had not sacrificed too much of my own life for the sake of preservation. None that matter, I said, and meant it. What about you? She squeezed my arm and smiled in the way that had become as familiar as my own reflection. I got to love two good men and watch one good woman find her purpose. I got to spend my days caring for something beautiful and permanent. How could there be regrets in that? We walked back to the cabin through snow that squeaked under our boots and air so clear it seemed to ring like crystal. Behind us, the cave settled into its nightly silence, painted walls holding their vigil over sleeping mountains and dreaming valleys, and the long story of human beings trying to leave something meaningful behind. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen with soup warming on the stove and financial reports spread across the table. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the Foundation's latest quarterly statement. She had become our most dedicated board member, bringing the same analytical precision to preservation work that had made her successful in real estate. The numbers look good, she announced as we stamped snow off our boots. Donations are up, operating costs are stable, and the education center is booked solid through next summer. We might even have enough surplus to fund that graduate research fellowship you have been wanting to establish. I hung my coat on the peg Dad had installed decades earlier and marveled at how the same kitchen that had once felt like a burden now felt like the center of work that mattered more than anything I had ever done. The cave paintings had taught me that permanence was possible if enough people cared enough to make it happen, one careful choice at a time. Over dinner, we planned the next year's programs and discussed applications for the research fellowship and debated the merits of various proposals for expanding educational outreach. It was the kind of conversation I had never imagined having with Sarah, practical and passionate and focused on questions larger than personal advancement. After she left to drive back down the mountain, Elena and I settled into our evening routine of reading and quiet companionship, the fire casting dancing shadows on walls that held their own ancient paintings in the form of family photographs and foundation awards and letters from grateful visitors who had been changed by their encounter with something older and wiser than themselves. I opened Dad's journal to a page I had read hundreds of times but which still offered new insights. His neat handwriting describing his dreams for the site and his fears about whether his daughters would understand what he was trying to preserve. You were right about everything, I whispered to the pages, to the man who had chosen protection over profit and trust over control, and who had somehow known that love could take the form of responsibility willingly accepted. Outside, the mountains settled into winter sleep under stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck like apples from the sky. The cave paintings rested in their limestone gallery, safe for another night under the guardianship of people who had learned that the greatest treasures were not the ones you could own but the ones you could protect for others to discover and wonder at and love. Tomorrow there would be new visitors and old challenges, and the endless patient work of stewardship that never finished but always mattered. Tonight there was just this moment of deep satisfaction, knowing that precious things remained precious, that sacred places stayed sacred, that some stories continued exactly as they should when ordinary people chose extraordinary responsibility and discovered that protection could be its own form of prayer.